So, some miscellaneous technical details. I guess some of you guys are more interested in this than all of the leaks and things like that. You want to know how we run a system like this. Basically, compartmentalization. That's the key, right? You want to make sure that things are compartmentalized. It's absolutely imperative that we have a situation that when we involve a new person, they don't have access to everything. Think about the content that we're dealing with, and then you instantly understand why that is a necessity. So when we get new people involved, you might get access to a system at some point. And when you get access to that system, it will be a very small sliver of access. And you'll have to work in a way that shows that it is not possible for you to betray us. I think that's totally reasonable. What do you guys think? Awesome. Inch by inch, right? So, more horsepower. We've got a lot of servers driving a lot of things, and it's working out relatively well. I think that it's, in fact, extremely important for making sure that these things are going to stay up, and they're going to be able to do their job. Collateral murder was hosted on a new architecture, and, of course, very few people noticed that because it went off without a hitch. There was no question, it just worked. But there were very special improvements to make that possible. But if you do find a problem, I have an idea. This is a novel one. Some journalists out there in other publications that shall not be named, well, quite frankly, they, instead of dropping into IRC, which might be too difficult for them to use, or sending an email in a reasonable amount of time, they don't do those things. So you can do that instead. If you notice, or you have a monitoring system and you want to toss it up and you want to monitor the system a little bit in a not too invasive of a way, we would totally love to hear from you, right? We can use your help. If you see something wrong, you see something that has expired, or you see some piece of information that has changed, if you see a certificate that's being man in the middle by an ISP, if you see that you can't reach the site, let us know. Chances are, if you can't reach the site, you can use Tor to reach the site, and then you can isolate the network problem, and you can figure out who's doing what. And of course, we want to basically take the information that we have that is in the wiki, and we want to move it into sort of more interesting forms of being. So that's something that we're very much working on, and we think that the wiki is extremely important, but we also think that there's something more than that. So it's going to change some bit in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tor. Have you all heard about that enough by now, I guess? Yeah. You've all heard of Tor, right? Okay. First, as a developer, allow me to apologize for it being sometimes slow. I'm sorry. As I said in the Tor talk yesterday with Seth, I don't know how fast you want to die, but we need to do it securely. That's the first and most important thing. There are people who use this software in every country of the world, and some of them use it because that is their threat model. So we want to make sure that it is privacy, security, and anonymity by design, not speedy for BitTorrenting. There are VPNs for that. So I'm sorry that it isn't faster, but it works, and it works pretty well. So WikiLeaks really supports Tor, and that means that sometimes they run servers. It means sometimes they make sure that some systems are accessible, like specifically over Tor. For example, the submission system. That submission system that is a .onion is one that if you have some concerns, that's definitely the best one to use. It'll be very, very difficult for someone to know or to tamper with. It's end-to-end encrypted, right? The .onion URL, in fact, is a cryptographic key. So if you have that right URL, you have end-to-end encryption that assures that you are talking to WikiLeaks, and those keys are extremely protected. And I think that that is the right thing for you to use if you want to. And of course, every document being available over Tor is something that we feel very strongly about. We especially support people using Tor to reach WikiLeaks. That is extremely important as well, because not everybody has the right to visit that site. And not everyone wants to tie themselves to having visited that site. And while many of you might be supporters vocally, some of you might only be supporters inside. So use an anonymization system so that you don't have to taint yourself if you don't want to. And of course, there's a lot of development that needs to happen. For example, Tor uses TCP connections between all of the other Tor nodes. That means that all of the circuits and connections are multiplexed between single TCP connections. And we're working on some alternate designs, potentially UDP with DTLS and using SCTP on top of that, which means that we would have an ability to do better flow control, and it would allow us to not have so many bottlenecks. But in order to do that, we need some badass developers. And Tor, of course, is at sometimes, and especially right now, hiring. So if you want to quit your corporate job and come work at the very best free software company to save the world, well, we're looking for some help. So if you don't want to quit your job and you're enjoying it just fine, we could also use some more relays, and especially exit relays. And if you're worried about abuse, limit it so that it can only exit to WikiLeaks if that's what you want to support. You can send a very strong message and you can help a great deal. Because anonymity is required not just for our sources, but also many of our readers. So you can be part of the solution on that. I think Julian would probably end with something I think that is, I guess, a little more inspiring. He would say something in his typical Australian accent and flop his blonde hair around and smile a lot. But I will just say this, which is that we don't know anything without knowing about history. These leaks that we've been talking about, they are the guidebook for the future because they're not written to coerce. They're not written for someone to manipulate your opinion. These are written specifically as inside documents that tell you how these organizations work, tell you about events that occurred. It lets you know what's actually going on. And when you piece these documents together, it allows you to know what the future will know about history. It will pave a road that we can walk on as a human culture, not as nation-state isolated people, not as people that are grouped into good and bad, but what everyone can learn. The progress of science is because people came before us and made painstaking efforts to understand the way that the world worked. And so we have to do the same thing with historical records, not just with scientific knowledge. Although it's important to move journalism in the direction of science by making sure that they have a citation, right? We've all seen the XKCD comic that talks about citation needed. Well, this is really important that we hold journalists to this. When they say, some source says this, sometimes there's a need for anonymity, that's quite clear. But when they say, many of their critics say this thing, sometimes we look that up. We look up who the critics are, and it's usually like one person on one blog somewhere searched for 6 hours to find. So they should cite that, so that people know that that statement is about as credible as it isn't, actually. So I understand that there is a little bit of tension about the fact that we're not always the best to respond. We have limited resources, and you can only imagine the amount of contact that we get. IRC is probably a little bit better, because it means that people are constantly reading it. But it's very obvious that while some of you want to do the right thing, there are a few people, a few bad apples, that want to do the wrong thing. And so we have to be very, very careful about who we let in, because we have things that, quite frankly, could mean the difference between life and death. And so please be patient with us, because we want to work with you. We have to work with you. We need your help. But we can't always be there and respond instantly. So don't be upset if you send us an email and you don't get a response 5 minutes later. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes it might take weeks, because there are things that are going on inside that just quite simply we can't drop, no matter how much help. It is much easier if you say, I can offer 10 gigabits a second, mail me a box, no hassle, no problem, than it is if you say, well, tell me about your requirements and what do you need and so on. And we have to take a lot of time. So if you've got that, do the first, not the second. And if you don't have the ability to do the first, please don't do the second. Wait until you're able. And of course, this is probably the most important. If you just work on the things, like I see there's some Noisebridge people in back, like Steen back there, who's really into visualizations. Work on things for large-scale data sets for visualizations like he's doing. I mean, he has nothing to do with this, but the fact that he has inspired us to think about the fact that visualizations like that can really make a big impact. And that is something that, if you just work on that, your work speaks for itself. And we can help to direct you a little bit, but you can direct yourself. Your creative tasks, the way that you work, will be extremely powerful. And of course, it's really important that you make it public, and especially if you can release source code. And source code is very helpful because it allows us to make sure that you're not sending us, for example, a binary that when we run, it does something kind of nasty. I mean, we all know how to use IDA Pro, but we don't want to waste our time doing that, right? Send us source code and show us that you want to work with us. And I'd like to emphasize this phrase: think globally, hack locally.